What's going on, APUSH peeps? We have a video for you today on Chapter 22 of Alan Brinkley's American History. This one is titled The New Era, all about the Roaring Twenties. So let's get going. We're going to start off talking about the new economy of the 1920s. But before we do, it's important to take a look at the 1920 census. This is for the first time ever. More people are living in urban areas than they are in rural areas. So this is a drastic demographic shift in United States history. Some new technology that comes about during the 1920s includes the radio, and by the end of the 1920s, almost every family had one. Trains are also more efficient and they can go further and faster with less gas due to the new diesel engine. The standard of living rose for many workers during the 1920s, and in part it was introduced by an idea called welfare capitalism, which was Henry Ford's brainchild, and some other business leaders used this model as well. And this included a shorter work week, higher wages, and paid vacations. Henry Ford realized that most of his employees would also be consumers, so he paid them more so they could buy things like the Model T car. However, this system ended after 1929 with the Great Depression. During the 1920s, the average income for workers was $1,500 a year, yet $1,800 was needed to maintain a minimally decent standard of living. So a lot of workers are still living under what was necessary to have a decent standard of living. The AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, still did not include unskilled labor during this time. Keep that in the back of your head. They are a skilled only labor organization. Women during the 1920s tended to work pink-collar jobs, which included secretaries, sales clerks, and phone operators, and these tended to be the lower-paying jobs. African Americans also, unfortunately, worked the lower-paying jobs, and they tended to be janitors, dishwashers, and garbage collectors. And therefore, women and African Americans were left out of the AFL because of the jobs they tended to work in were low-skilled jobs. A. Phillip-Randolph is a very influential African American civil rights leader. He was the head of a union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he called for increased wages, shorter working hours, etc. And he actually later on is very influential in the 1940s with some civil rights that African Americans gain. He proposes a march on Washington, but I'm getting a little ahead. We'll talk about that in future chapters. Japanese Americans during the 1920s were discriminated against when California passed a series of laws making it difficult for Japanese to buy land. Businesses during the 1920s did a really good job of associating unions with being subversive or radical or even being associated with communists. And keep in mind, the 1920s really started off with the first Red Scare. So there's this fear that many in America are associated with communism. In 1921, the Supreme Court upheld a ruling that said that picketing was illegal and courts could issue injunctions to break up picketing. When you go on strike, you picket. When you carry a sign protesting. So what do you do when you go on strike? You picket. What do you do when your nose goes on strike? You picket, huh? You like that? Yeah, I've used that before, but it's so good. All right, let's talk about farmers. Production in the 1920s is going to heavily outweigh demand. World War I is over, and they keep producing at World War I levels, even though the demand is not there. When in doubt, ladies and gentlemen, very, very important to know, until we get to chapter 24 with the New Deal, when in doubt, farmers never, ever, ever decrease production of their crops. They keep producing more in hopes of making more money, but that inevitably leads to prices falling. So if you ever see a multiple choice question about farmers and decreasing crop production, that does not happen until the New Deal. Please make sure you know that. Farmers did hope to achieve parity, which, and the purpose of this was to ensure that farmers would get back at least their production costs, but this really was not very effective, in part because it was passed by Congress but vetoed by Coolidge. So many times farmers don't even get their production costs back. All right, let's talk about the culture. When we think of the 1920s, this is what we think of: consumer culture. We see a huge increase in spending on new appliances, including refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, you name it. A lot of appliances that you have today can really date back to the 1920s. Also, automobiles, there were 30 million of them by the end of the 1920s, so lots of people were owning cars. This helped lead to the first development of suburbs. So this idea that you're not living in rural areas, You're not living in cities, you're living somewhere in between, suburbs. And cars also allowed for an increase in travel and vacations as well. So people are seeing a lot more of the country than they had before. Book doesn't really talk about Charles Lindbergh, but it's important to know him. He was a part of the first solo flight without a radio from America to Europe. He actually flies from America to Paris. It takes him something like 27 hours of straight flying. And he does it on the plane you can see in the background, the Spirit of St. Louis. He becomes an overnight sensation and a really, not only in the United States, but in Europe and the world as well. So an instant celebrity. He was 27 years old when he flew from America to Europe. I'm 32. I've never done anything like that. Sad. So let's talk about advertising. There is a new booming industry that develops, and this is heavily influenced by the World War I propaganda techniques. A very important book you should know is The Man Nobody Knows, and this book stated that Jesus was the first salesman. We also see that newspapers increase in circulation. You see national chains beginning to develop, and magazines as well begin to develop, including Time Magazine and Reader's Digest, still around today. When we're talking about culture, we're going to talk about movies. You absolutely, positively must be able to identify the jazz singer. This was the first talkie movie, or the first movie with synchronous sound, or in other words, the first movie that had sound. Absolutely, positively be able to identify the jazz singer. I've seen it before. I'll see it again, I can promise you. All right, women in the 1920s. Professional jobs included fashion, education, social work, and nursing. Notice that there is not doctors and lawyers in there. So a lot of the professional jobs that women had tended to be dominated by women. Most middle class women, however, did not work outside the home. So motherhood in the 1920s is influenced by a behaviorist, John B. Watson. He and others believed that mothers should rely on experts for raising children. And when we're talking about women in the 1920s, absolutely positively know this one, Margaret Sanger. I've seen her many, many times on exams. She advocated birth control and contraceptives. And birth control in the 1920s was illegal in many places. She really pushed for birth control to be legal. She was instrumental in that. This upset many religious fundamentalists. Flappers. Here's an image of an actress who was portraying a flapper. This is really more of an image than a reality. But flappers did have short, and I put ER in parentheses because you can see that would be considered a shorter dress, and they also had shorter hair, and they would smoke, drink, and if you can believe it or not, they would even dance. And this would be very, very shocking for many individuals in the 1920s. The National Women's Party was founded during this time, and Alice Paul was a prominent member. We talked a little bit about her during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and we'll talk a lot about her going forward in this course, but she proposed an equal rights amendment for women. This was eventually defeated many, many years later. Education in the 1920s saw an increase in high school and college attendance, quite a bit actually. High school attendance doubled, college attendance tripled. Schools play a large role in social development. This is where you really begin to see sports teams and different clubs in school really play an influential role. The Lost Generation was a group of writers, absolutely be able to identify the Lost Generation. They resented many of these middle class ideas and ideals that came about during the 1920s. So they criticized middle class society. Two examples are Ernest Hemingway, and he wrote a book, A Farewell to Arms, and H.L. Mencken, he wrote two different magazines, Smart Set and American Mercury. These were magazines that criticized middle class values. After World War II, we'll learn about a group of writers called the Beat Generation. I have seen multiple choice questions comparing the Lost Generation and the Beat Generation, or the purpose of either. Definitely know that they criticize middle class values. Okay, do not forget that, please. During the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance was also a huge part of the decade, and this promoted African American culture through poetry, music, such as jazz, and also literature and art as well. And this focused on discrimination that African Americans face. This is really a celebration of African American culture. One of the most famous members of the Harlem Renaissance was Langston Hughes, a writer, and the book gives a line from one of Langston Hughes' writings. It says, "I am a Negro and a beautiful." So again, it's this really big celebration of African American culture. Okay, we're going to go to a conflict of cultures now. So not all things are as great as they seem in the 1920s. We see Prohibition. This is nicknamed the Noble Experiment. It was very popular in the South and the West. Remember, cities, you had saloons, you had immigrants that really celebrated the drinking culture, and in the South and the West you don't see it so much. There are problems with prohibition in the 18th Amendment. People like to drink. There was very weak enforcement both on a local and national scale, and many people were hostile to the law. Many people did not support the law. Government officials, police officers were easily bribed, and this leads to an increase in organized crime. So organized crime really begins to develop as a result of prohibition. There is a huge demand for illegal alcohol, especially in large cities such as Chicago. This is where you see Al Capone, this notorious gangster, come along, and he is very popular. It is he who is responsible for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, in which many of his enemies were killed. 7 gang members were killed. Nativism, can't talk about U.S. history without talking about nativism, is in full force in the 1920s. There are 2 acts. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 is the first one that you should know. And here is a very famous political cartoon demonstrating this. What this does is it restricted the number of immigrants from a country to 3% of the total people from that country living in the United States in 1910. So I'm going to do really simple math numbers here. Let's say there are 100 Germans living in the United States in 1910. That means only 3 Germans could immigrate to the country in 1921 and thereafter. So you see Uncle Sam here putting a 3% restriction rate on all these immigrants coming in. So the fewer immigrants there are in a country in 1910, the even fewer immigrants that could come in as a result of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This favored Southern and Eastern Europe, these new immigrants. So a lot of people are still upset with it. They want to restrict these new immigrants. So they passed 3 years later the Immigration Act of 1924. This cuts the percentage from 3% to 2%, so it's even less. However, it no longer uses the 1910 census, it uses the 1890 census. There's a lot fewer immigrants in 1890 than there was in 1910, so a lot fewer immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this definitely hurt new immigrants. But the key thing to know about these 2 acts is that it marked an end of an era of unrestricted immigration. No longer can immigrants just flow into this country. There are severe restrictions. And as I have written here, Japanese immigrants were not allowed to immigrate to this country. I do have 2 videos on this. One, new immigrants, and the other is nativism in the 1920s. I have links in the description below, which I go a little further in detail in these 2 acts. So if you're confused, please check those out. All right, in the 1920s, we see the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, and this time they focus on anti-foreignism as well as discrimination against African Americans. And again, in 1915, we saw the full-length film Birth of a Nation, which glorified the KKK, so this helped increase membership. By the mid-1920s, 5 million Americans were registered members of the KKK, so it's an enormous amount of people. However, scandals, including embezzlement, helped lead to the decline of the Klan. That should be a K, not a C. I apologize. All right, we have the monkey trial, or the Scopes trial. John Scopes, a biology teacher from Tennessee, he violated a law by teaching evolution. If this guy does not look like a science teacher, I don't know who does. The prosecutor was the 3-time presidential loser, William Jennings Bryan, and the defense attorney was well-known defense attorney Clarence Darrow. Scopes, after a long trial, John T. Scopes was found guilty of violating a Tennessee law in teaching evolution, and he had to pay a $100 fine. And this really demonstrates the tensions between fundamentalism and modernism or secularism in the United States in the 1920s. This helped fuel religion versus secularism for many more years. Democrats in the 1920s, we're going to focus on a guy, Alfred Smith. He was a Roman Catholic, and he ran for president in 1928, and he does lose in part because he was a Catholic. We will not see another Catholic run for president again until 1960 with JFK. My students, please write down, JFK is the next Catholic to run for president in 1960. All right, we have to finish up with some scandals in the 1920s. The 1920s is seen as an end to progressive legislation, including progressive decisions from the Supreme Court. And this idea is best captured with Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy. Now, some of the scandals that you should be familiar with are the Teapot Dome scandal. The Secretary of Interior, his name was Fall. He transferred land to his department and then secretly leased this land to oil companies and took $100,000 in bribes. So he had no business giving this land to oil companies, but he did, and in return he got $100,000. And here's a very famous political cartoon you should be familiar with. You have a teapot, and it was an oil scandal, and it's going right towards the White House highway or towards the White House. Just like President Grant, another president from Ohio, Warren G. Harding was associated with corruption and scandal. Definitely be familiar with those two terms as it applies to Warren G. Harding and President Grant. Calvin Coolidge becomes president upon the death of Warren G. Harding, and he advocated a laissez-faire government, the government having very little involvement in the economy. Absolutely positively be familiar with this guy, Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon under Coolidge. He favored tax cuts for the wealthy, and this idea is known as trickle-down economics, and you will see this again later by Ronald Reagan. So whether it's the 1980s under Ronald Reagan or the 1920s under Calvin Coolidge, the government cut taxes for the wealthy in hopes that the wealthy would then spend money and create businesses to help out the United States economy. All right, that's everything you need to know for Chapter 22. Thank you very much for watching. If you have not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button below and share this with anybody else who you think would find this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day, guys.